My sister-in-law stood in my kitchen the week before my wedding, still wearing her coat, and told me the whole family had voted. Her word voted to stay home. To teach me some humility, she said it gently, the way you'd tell a child the stove is hot. I set down the dish towel I was holding and said, "All right, Carol." Then I watched her let herself out past the porch I'd painted for the reception, and I went back to wiping down counters while the light turned gray over the yard. For 31 years, I had been the quiet one in that family. The one who hosted, who drove, who never asked for anything back. This was the first time I didn't apologize for wanting something. But what happened 4 years later when that same family came asking me for a favor is the part Carol still can't quite look at me while discussing. My name is Eleanor Voss. I'm 69. I buried my first husband, Walter, after 38 years of marriage, and I did not expect at 65 to fall in love again. But I did with a widower named Sam Ferris, a retired cabinet maker with sawdust permanently ground into the lines of his hands and a laugh that made me feel, for the first time in a decade, like a person instead of a widow. When Sam asked me to marry him, in his workshop, holding a small wooden box he'd built with his own hinges, I said yes before he'd even opened it. My late husband's family, his sister Carol, his brother Michael, their grown children did not take it well. I understand grief moves people in strange directions. What I didn't expect was for that grief to be dressed up as concern for my dignity, as though loving someone again at 65 was something shameful I needed correcting out of. It started small. Carol mentioned more than once that Walter wasn't even 5 years gone, Michael asked, at Thanksgiving, whether Sam knew about the money situation in a tone that made it sound like an accusation rather than a question. I let it pass. I had spent 3 decades being the one who smoothed things over in that family, the one who hosted every holiday at my table so no one else had to, the one who never once asked Walter's siblings for so much as a ride to the airport. Being easy to get along with had always been my job description. I didn't realize until much later that a family only assigns that job to the one person they don't think they need to be careful with. The real trouble started 6 weeks before the wedding, when Carol found out I intended to hold the ceremony in the backyard of the house, Walter's house, technically still half-owned by the family trust his father had set up. Though I'd lived in it, maintained it, and paid its taxes for 11 years running. Carol called it disrespectful. Walter's home, she said for that, I offered, reasonably, to move the ceremony to the community hall downtown instead, so no one would have to feel it happening under that roof. Carol said it wasn't really about the house. It never is. In families like that, it's never about the thing they name. It's about whether you're still willing to shrink. Michael called that Tuesday, and I heard in his voice the particular gentleness people use right before they hand you something ugly. "You've always been the sensible one, Ellie," he said. "That's what makes this hard to watch." He walked me through it the way you'd explain a rule of nature, that Walter deserved a widow, not a wedding, that the family had already given me more patience than most people would, that all he was asking was a little humility. The thing that had held the family together this long. I gripped the edge of the counter, the same counter Walter had once refinished with his own hands, and said something I had never said to Michael in 30 years. "I don't think that's humility, Michael. I think it's just me disappearing, and you calling it a virtue." Silence on the line. "Sleep on it," he said. "You'll feel differently in the morning." I didn't. Here is what finally made the shape of it clear to me. Sam's daughter, visiting from out of state, mentioned in passing that Michael had recently asked Walter's estate attorney, a man named Preston, who had handled Walter's affairs for over a decade, about accelerating the trust distribution now that I was starting a new household. I hadn't known there was a distribution being discussed at all. I called Preston myself the next morning and asked him plainly whether a co-trustee could petition to move up disbursements without notifying the other beneficiary, me. He went quiet the particular way lawyers go quiet. "No," he said, "not without written notice to you first." "Did you receive anything in writing?" I hadn't. He asked me to send over what I did have: statements. Any messages from Michael about the trust, the original document. I started a folder that night, .com/methodical. The way Sam checks a joint before he trusts it with weight. I didn't tell Michael or Carol I was gathering anything. I still hosted Sunday dinner. I still answered Carol's calls. I let them believe the only conversation happening was the one about my wedding, because people get careless when they think they've already won. The ultimatum came 2 weeks out, delivered the way Michael always delivered bad news, gently, over coffee he'd asked me to make. "If you go through with this in that house," he said, "none of us will come. Not me, not Carol, not the kids. We'll boycott it." Sometimes the only way to teach someone humility is to let them stand alone. He believed that too. That's the part you have to understand about people like Michael. He wasn't being cruel in his own mind. He thought he was correcting someone who'd wandered off the path. I didn't beg. I walked him to the door and said, I understand your decision. I'm keeping mine. My voice didn't shake, and that surprised me more than anything else that year. 9 days before the wedding, I learned Michael had also quietly withdrawn a written pledge made back when things were warm to cover the cost of restoring Walter's father's old workshop, the one Sam had been planning to convert into our shared studio, using trust funds earmarked for property maintenance. The contractor called me directly when the deposit bounced. Sam closed his laptop that night, looked at the numbers with me and said, "We'll pay for it ourselves. We'll do the smaller version first. The big renovation can wait." We did. The studio got smaller in scope and somehow more exactly ours. No one came to the wedding. 40 guests did. Neighbors, Sam's children, my 2 nieces from my own side of the family, and Preston, who came not just as a guest but with a folder of his own. We married in the backyard under a maple Walter had planted decades earlier, and I stood there in the fading October light thinking that this, finally, was a room I hadn't had to shrink to fit into. That was 4 years ago. Sam and I built a quiet, full life. The studio finished on our own terms. Sunday dinners that got smaller and warmer. A marriage nobody had to bless for it to be real. Then, 3 months ago, Michael called, warm, almost sheepish, in a voice I hadn't heard from him in years. His son's small business, a landscaping company he'd sunk his savings into, was underwater, and Michael needed a cosigner on a loan large enough that the bank wanted a second guarantor with clean credit and real assets. Mine, specifically, since I still held partial title to a rental property that had once been part of Walter's estate and had since been fully and legally transferred to me in the trust settlement. The same settlement Preston's letter had forced open 4 years earlier. Michael didn't call it a favor at first. He called it keeping the family together. He said Walter would have wanted his nephew to have a chance. He said, gently, that this was a way for everyone to put the wedding business behind them. I let him finish. Then I asked him one question. "Michael, did the family come to the wedding?" A pause on the line, the kind he used to make you feel the size of your mistake, except this time it was landing on him instead. "That's not really the same thing," he said. "I think it's exactly the same thing," I said. "You taught me humility by staying home from the most important day of the second half of my life. I learned the lesson. I just didn't learn the one you meant." I told him I wasn't co-signing anything, but that I would help his son directly, a smaller loan structured through Preston in my own name, with my own terms, given because I wanted to, not because anyone had earned it back by asking. Michael went quiet again, and this time I let the silence sit, instead of filling it the way I used to. Carol still won't quite meet my eyes at holidays. Michael's son got his loan on my terms, and he's kept up every payment. Sam built a second bench for the studio last spring, wide enough for 2. And most evenings now, it's just us out there with sawdust on the floor and no one to answer to about it. If someone in your life ever taught you that love has to be re-earned every time you take up space, I hope you take this as your sign that you're allowed to stop paying. Would you have helped Michael's son at all? Or was I already too generous?